Our text comes from Genesis 41, 32 through 57, the end of the chapter. Joseph is speaking, and he's explaining the dream and its consequences to Pharaoh and suggests a plan. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever there's a problem, someone identifies the problem, I always find it really helpful when they have a solution. That works nicely. Now, I don't know about you, I suspect at times you've had solutions given to you you weren't terribly excited about. But still, it's nice to have a solution. When you have a problem you have no solution for, that's really frustrating. Joseph had a plan. Begins. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter had been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man to put in charge of all the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of those good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in the robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as the second command, and the men shouted before him, Make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph said, there was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, Go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. It's a long piece, but it's a continuous narrative, and to break it into smaller parts just didn't seem to make sense. But this is Joseph's meteoric rise. It covers a period of some 14 years, excuse me. So at the age of 30, he is given the job of essentially being the second in command of Egypt. And for the next 14 years, this is what happens. 7 good years, 7 bad years. He collected food, and he sold it to the people when it was time. But not just the people of Egypt, to all the nations that would come looking for food. All the peoples who would come looking for food. Now, what do we do with Joseph? He's an interesting character. Unlike his father, he doesn't seem to be a trickster. In fact, he seems to be the first in the line that integrity is an important part of his life. And it seems that his integrity has been more important to him than even going to jail. Now, we know the whole story about what happened in Potiphar's house with Potiphar's wife and what could have happened. I'm sure had he been his father, there would have been a crafty solution to the problem. However, it wouldn't have resulted in him 2 years later coming before Pharaoh and having a plan to take care of Egypt. So you think about it, he had a pretty good gig in Potiphar's house. He was running the household. He was in charge of one of the large households in Egypt. He was second in command to one of Pharaoh's important officials. He was in a place of some respectability. But for him, it was more important to hold on to his integrity than it was to hold on to his position. So he ends up in jail, where he meets the cupbearer and the baker. They both have dreams, and he has an interpretation for him. Now he said, he gave a good interpretation to the cupbearer. You're going to be back at your old job very soon, and when you get back to Pharaoh's service, remember me, take care of me, get me out of this jail. But we all know what happened. The cupbearer got back to his job and promptly forgot about Joseph. But God didn't. 2 years later, Pharaoh has this dream, this bizarre dream of cannibalistic cows and cannibalistic wheat. I don't know what the cows look like eating cows. I don't know what the wheat looked like eating wheat. That's just not an image I particularly want in my head. And all of Pharaoh's interpreters, the priests who were responsible for helping him to understand what these dreams meant. Because in Egyptian culture, understanding the dreams meant understanding the God's will. They couldn't do it. This was a point of crisis for the state. And now Joseph is called upon as an advisor to interpret these dreams that Pharaoh has had. And he doesn't. 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of want that will consume everything that was there before. So he tells Pharaoh the good news that 7 years of plenty are coming, but the bad news that 7 years of famine follow. And before he stops to accept the accolades for interpreting this dream that no one else could, he lays out the plan of how to deal with the 7 bad years. Now, it's at this point I have a question. I don't know if this is Joseph's innate ability to organize and plan, or if this is God's gift to him to see his way through the problem. The text never makes it clear which is which, but we do know that Joseph, as soon as he's confronted with the problem, offers a solution to the problem. And the solution he proposes is, well, pretty simple. Take 1/5 of the grain that's produced during the 7 good years and store it up and wait for the bad years to come. Set it aside, use it when you need it. Now, in truth, that's never a bad idea, is it? Now, we don't grow much grain here, but it's always good to have savings to draw on in cases of emergency. backup plan that's there if you need it. This is good wisdom. Joseph presents the plan. You can see it here. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter had been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning, wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of those good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. It's a good plan. It makes sense. It's reasonable. It's logical. It's wisdom. We can spend a lot of time talking about the plan and how good it is and how we should do the same kind of thing. You get that. We don't need to talk about it anymore. The really interesting thing here is notice the way that the language is used. Anybody know the number of gods that Egyptians worshipped?
More than one.
More than one. There were many. Honestly, I have no idea what the official count is. When I started counting them off in my head, I got to about 13 or 14. And then I couldn't name any more. But I know I was not at the end, because as I was doing research into some of the stories, I found new gods that I never heard of before. And the god that's mentioned in the text, Joseph's wife's father, he was the priest of On. No idea who he was or what he did. There are a lot of them, to say the least. But every time that Joseph mentions a deity, it's always singular. He's talking about Yahweh, the Hebrew deity, the God of this small group of people, the descendants of Abraham, who are living in Canaan. He's not talking about the God of the Canaanites, because the Canaanites have many deities. Some Canaanites did include Yahweh in their pantheon, it's true, but they also had other gods. Some of Abraham's relatives also worshipped multiple gods. It seems like some of the cousins were also, well, worshipers of Yahweh. You know, if you remember the story of Moses when he leaves Egypt and he gets married, he marries the daughter of Jethro. Zipporah? Is that right? Oh. Her father was the priest of God in Midian. Now, we don't think about it in really close terms, but in reality, the Midianites are cousins of the Hebrews, as are the Ishmaelites. And you recall when Joseph was taken into Egypt, he was taken into Egypt by a Midianite trader. I can't help but think of the family reunion they had to be difficult. But there are other people who worship Yahweh, but when Joseph talks about God, he's speaking specifically about Yahweh. In other words, it's like he's saying to Pharaoh, I know you have a whole slew of gods, each with their own responsibilities, but the reality is that my God is going to bring 7 years of plenty on Egypt, and then 7 years of famine, and he has firmly decided this, and it's going to happen soon. That's why you had this dream in two forms. Incidentally, it's also the reason that none of your interpreters can interpret the dream, because this is from Yahweh, not from your gods, and Yahweh is greater than your gods combined. As I said, these are previews of the coming contest between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt that we see in the Exodus. There is a statement here about who is greater, who is more potent, who is more powerful. And every time that Joseph talks about deities, he's talking about Yahweh. He uses God in the singular. And you have to come to the conclusion that the Egyptians heard this as well. I mean, if someone mentions God's plural, you hear it right away because your ear is accustomed to hearing God in the singular. And if you're used to hearing God in the singular, and you hear God, it's apparent. But if you're always used to hearing God's in the plural, and now there's this person, this Hebrew slave, who's talking about God in the singular, it does get a hearing. People are aware it doesn't sound right. And Joseph is never apologetic about it. Now, if you look at verse 37, it says, "The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, 'Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has made this known to you, there is no one discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. With only respect to the throne will I be greater than you.' So Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt.'" What happens here is a parallel of what happened in Potiphar's house. In Potiphar's house, what did Potiphar have to worry about? Only about his food, what he was going to eat and drink. And in Potiphar's house, there was only one thing that was withheld from Joseph. That was Potiphar's wife. Here again, we find Joseph suddenly finding himself in a place where he is the second in command, and everything that takes place is under his authority. I suppose you could say the third time if we talk about what happened in jail too, but we'll take the bigger pictures. But notice what Pharaoh says. This is interesting. "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" It's again singular. So Pharaoh is not saying one in whom is the spirit of Ra. He's not naming one of the Egyptian deities. In fact, what he's doing is relying on the God who gave him the dream. In other words, Pharaoh is recognizing that this Hebrew God has authority in the land of Egypt. And he's looking for someone in whom the spirit of this powerful deity rests. And his only choice is Joseph. We live in a monotheistic world for the most part. I mean, I realize there are still polytheists in our world today, but in Western culture, for nearly 2,000 years, we have largely understood the world as being one God. And that's just kind of the way our worldview is pointed. This was not the case in ancient Egypt. It was a polytheistic world, and the notion of only worshiping one God would have been, well, atheistic. In fact, early Christians were often accused of being atheists because they denied the existence of all the gods that were familiar and only said there was one God. This is a much different worldview. And for Pharaoh to take this kind of a risky step really displays just how much the dreams that he had disturbed him. And not just the dreams, the fact that none of his advisors, none of his experts could help him to solve the riddle of what this dream meant. It bothered him so much that he is willing to find a person that is connected to this deity and put them in charge of everything. I suspect this would not have been very popular in Egyptian press. Now, to what extent that made a difference to Pharaoh, I don't know. This was an absolute monarchy. What Pharaoh wanted, Pharaoh got. Even if you look at what happened when, which Pharaoh was it that chose to worship one God? This wasn't in my notes. Wasn't planning to mention it. Well, one Pharaoh decided they would worship one god. Akhenaten. There we go. I knew it was there somewhere. All the other temples were closed. The other priests were put out of jobs. And only Aten was worshipped. Now, it didn't last very long, just the reign of this one Pharaoh. But Pharaoh was so powerful, he could force the closing of all these temples and transform the religious practices of Egypt by himself. So there's likely to be some pushback against Joseph. But to what extent is it really going to matter? Probably not a lot. Well, a number of things happened for Joseph. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way." Thus, he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt." Notice some of the symbols that are there. The signet ring that goes on Joseph's finger. New robes, a gold chain, riding with Pharaoh in his chariot. These are all symbols of family. In fact, if you think about it, there's a New Testament story that actually carries a very similar sort of scene. From Luke 15, verses 18 through 24. "I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe for him and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let us have a feast and celebrate. The son of mine who was dead is alive again. He who was lost is found.' So they began to celebrate." Now, I'm not saying that Joseph is the prodigal son in Pharaoh's life. What I am saying is some of those very same symbols are used to indicate that Pharaoh is now part of the household, or that Joseph is now part of the household of Pharaoh. Ring on the finger, a new robe, the gold chain were symbols of authority and power. The kind of things that would be passed from a father to a son in some cases. But what was happening to Joseph here is that he's being incorporated to the household of Pharaoh. In other words, at a certain point, he's like a son. Now, he may not be the heir to the throne, but he is one who has power and authority and received the appropriate symbols of that family. Now, it doesn't stop there. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. So Joseph gets a new name as well. Again, this is very, very common. What happens when Abram makes a covenant with God? He gets a new name, Abraham, as does Sarah. Jacob becomes Israel. When you enter the service of a king, it's not uncommon to have your name changed in the ancient world. Here, we see this practice happening again. The other thing, he's married into an important family. He gets a wife from an important family. He is, in many ways, tied into the Egyptian royal life in a number of ways. Signet ring, gold chain, appropriate clothing, a wife, a connected wife, we'll say. Authority and power. He is wrapped into this in a way that is very intentional. And in some ways, it looks like adoption.